So this guy Jonah, we've heard a lot about him. The big thing? He's been running. Why? Because he doesn't want God to forgive his enemies, the Ninevites. So why does Jonah hate these guys so much? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the biggest one is Jonah knew just how evil they actually were, and he didn't think they deserved a second chance. So he ran, hopped on a ship to sail away from God's call. But eventually, all that running caught up with him, and he found himself in a very dark place. Literally, the belly of a fish. So while in this belly, Jonah had time to think, and he ends up having a heart-to-heart with God, where he begins to get a taste of what grace actually is. And then the fish vomits him onto the shore. And this is where we pick up the story. See, Jonah received God's message loud and clear, and he heads towards the city of Nineveh. And you'd think this experience would really wake him up, maybe cause some real obedience. But Jonah decides to only give it half his effort. Yes, he goes to Nineveh, he stands before all the people, and what does he tell them? What's his big heartfelt message? Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned. What? That's it? 8 words? Jonah went all the way to Nineveh to preach an 8-word sermon. Okay, what's up with Jonah now? Let's find out.
Hey students, we are picking up in our last 2 chapters in the book of Jonah. So what we saw last week, that after a long journey of Jonah running away from God, his running came to a halt and he finally said, God, I will do what you want me to do. So here in chapter 3, we're also picking up that after he was swallowed by this giant fish, the fish spits him out right by Nineveh where he's going to go preach. And we see at the beginning of chapter 3 that he walks through Nineveh for 3 days. And we come to what seems to be the pinnacle of the book of Jonah, because finally he's about to do what God wanted him to do. And I can imagine him walking into the city, right, standing there, taking a deep breath, and we're ready for him to preach this awesome sermon. And all he says is, yet in 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown, right? And this is bizarre and kind of funny and comical for 2 reasons. One, we're kind of sitting here thinking, what? Like, is that it? After everything that God had done, the only thing you can say is an 8-word sermon. So some scholars who have studied the book of Jonah have actually said that this lines up with his attitude towards the Ninevites that we see in the rest of the book of Jonah, because he was most likely holding back information so that the Ninevites would not understand and know the message that God had for them. But the second reason this is bizarre is despite his really crappy sermon, it works, right? The most violent and perverse people in his time were converted and wanted to follow God from a really crappy 8-word sermon. In fact, we see that the word reaches the king and he tells everybody, he says, listen, strip off anything that might distract you. In fact, we're going to dress ourselves in sackcloth, which was this kind of really itchy cloth. And this was their way of saying, God, we mean business. We want to follow you. And then at the beginning of chapter 4, we see Jonah being angry and upset. And we have to ask the question, why is Jonah upset, right? I thought his running had come to a halt and when he wanted to do what God was expecting of him. So we ask the question. So I want to pick up in chapter 1, verse 2, and see the way that Jonah responds to God, right? So he's angry and he's complaining. This is what he says. Check this out. He says, and he prayed to the Lord and said to the Lord, O Lord, is this not what I had said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. This is why I ran away, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, that you are slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. So this is the picture that we get. And we have Jonah. First of all, he's arguing with the God of the universe, and he's saying, this is exactly why I didn't want to listen to you in the first place, because I knew that you were going to do things your way, not my way. But on top of that, he's complaining to God about being gracious, about being forgiving, and showing and extending forgiveness to the Ninevites. And in fact, what he's doing is he's quoting back from Exodus chapter 34, a book in the Old Testament. He's quoting back from the scene that we see in Exodus where the people of Israel, Jonah's family, the people that he came from, right, they had disobeyed God. God wanted what was best for them. They had disobeyed him, over and over again. God was about to be done with them, but there's a point where he says, okay, listen, you don't deserve this, but despite of what you've done, I'm going to stick with you, and I'm going to commit myself to you because I am gracious and I am slow to anger. So here we see Jonah arguing with the God of the universe and complaining over characteristics that were true about God, that if they weren't real, Jonah would not be alive that day. Right? It would be the equivalent, say that you owed somebody $1 million and they looked at you and they said, hey, there's no possible way that you could actually pay me back or that your parents could help you pay me back. And they said, all right, out of kindness, I'm just going to forgive your debt, right? You don't owe me anything. So you were set to go free, but then there was somebody else that you did not like, your arch enemy from the volleyball or football team, and they owed this person $1 million as well, and they got forgiven. You said, whoa, listen, no. I want them to go to jail, right? Why do you have to be so forgiving and so gracious and so kind? Right? You were forgiving because this person was kind and extended kindness to you. And this is exactly what Jonah is doing. So it's this really comical and silly picture that we get. But why is Jonah doing this? Listen, what I want to talk to you tonight is two things that I believe are true about Jonah, but also are true about us that we see here in this book. The first one is this, listen, that I don't believe grace and forgiveness comes natural to us. Right? What I mean is this, that we all like to talk about forgiveness and God's love and how he's merciful. And I mean, we put it on our mugs and our posters, on our Instagram bios and on our captions, on our pictures. But when it comes to the kind of forgiveness and grace that the Bible speaks of, there is a scandalous side to it. Because listen, it's the people that you least think deserve it. The people that in fact do more than go talk behind your back. The people that you might think deserve death. These are the people that God extends forgiveness and grace to. Right? So there is a scandalous side to it. And I would even argue that our bent, this doesn't come natural to us, our bent is actually the opposite, right? That we are naturally angry and cynical people. And I think that the clearest way that I've seen this play out has been in this rise of our social media world. Now, I'm a social media person. I think there's a lot of upsides to it. But I do think that social media has really exposed this in us, right? That what social media has done is that it's kind of heightened our awareness of things that are going on around us, but it's also heightened our emotions and our response to those things. So on social media, you might run into people that you really, really strongly disagree with. Or you might run into somebody that might tweet or post a picture that you might think is really wrong, or there's a video that goes viral over something that somebody did that you think is really wrong. And what social media has done is that our initial reaction to those things has been anger and lashing out. And there's been this attitude of, I want to own people in arguments all the time. In fact, some people even gone to the extent of posting somebody's address on social media because it has turned into, we want to ruin and we want to run people's lives into the ground, right? This is what social media has done because, again, I don't think forgiveness and grace, the way that the Bible describes it, is our natural bent, and it's not Jonah's bent either. So, listen, the second thing that I also think this points out about Jonah is this, and about us, that God does not work according to our terms. What I mean is this, that Jonah wanted God to destroy the people of Nineveh, to turn that city over and destroy it. But God had other plans. He turned that city over because he wanted them to be forgiven and follow him. And it bothered Jonah that he felt like he couldn't rein God's power in to work in a way that he saw fit. And I would argue that the reason he did this is because he was delusional and he was unable to see God for who he was, and in turn see himself for who he was in comparison to God. Right? So he did not trust God's goodness and his wisdom to do the right thing. And in fact, we see this in this really weird way that he responds to God after God forgave the Ninevites. And he says, fine, then just kill me. And we're just like, what? Like, why is he saying that? And God responds to Jonah very patiently, and he says, wait, so is it right for you to be upset that I forgave the Ninevites? Jonah doesn't respond. In fact, he pouts and he runs off. And then we get to this other weird scene in chapter 4 where he goes and he sits under this plant to get some shade. And he's sitting under the plant and he's pouting and he's complaining. And then God allows the plant to wither. And he gets upset, so he gets back up and he's complaining to God. And he says, "How dare you?" And God again patiently comes to him and he says, "Is it right for you to be upset about this plant?" And so he's trying to show Jonah something about himself. But Jonah responds, "Yes, I'm right to be angry about this plant. In fact, I'm angry enough for you to kill me and for me to die." And again, we're sitting here thinking, what? Is Jonah delusional? So we're trying to figure out what's going on. And not only is Jonah acting like my 4-year-old cousin, but what we see again is that the reason Jonah is acting this way is because he is unable to see God for who he is and who Jonah is in comparison to God. So then God responds to him. He says, "Why are you so worried about this plant when there are 120,000 people in the city of Nineveh withering and perishing because of their sin and because of their wicked ways?" So listen, this is what God is trying to do to Jonah in this moment. What he's trying to do to Jonah is he's trying to flip a mirror towards him and say, "Hey, listen, yes, the Ninevites are wicked and evil, but there is something that is wicked and evil inside of you." But even more so, right, what God is trying to do in the book of Jonah is he's trying to flip that mirror on us and say, "Hey, listen, you are Jonah, right? You are also delusional. You are also bent towards anger and towards selfishness, right? This is our condition as well." So then what God does in this, and the solution that he gives us, is that he completely redefines the word enemy, right? Jonah was worried about his enemies and how God would respond to his enemies, and he completely redefines it for us. And what I mean is this, that he tells Jonah, "Listen, there is a thread of evil that runs through every single one of us," right? And not that we're all as bad as we could be, but that every single one of us internally have rebelled against God and have therefore made ourselves enemies of God, that we are all deserving of wrath. So then what the book of Jonah does, just like any other book in the Bible, is that it funnels everything back down to the Gospels, to Jesus. Right? That there would come somebody who was a better Jonah. That unlike Jonah, who was reluctant to die for his enemies, Jesus would come and he would willingly die for his enemies. That unlike Jonah back in chapter 2, where he tried to jump off the boat to die so that he wouldn't have to die for his enemies, Jesus willingly did this. So God gives us a Jesus as the answer to our problem. And listen, students, what happens when we come to know Jesus and we follow Jesus is that the way that he works in us is that he wakes us up to be able to see the wickedness and the evil that's inside every single one of us. And when we see how much we are loved and understand his grace, the way that the Bible describes it, then Jesus calls us in Matthew chapter 5 to live in a way that is radically different, right? That not only he loves our enemies, but he calls us to love our enemies as well in a way that nobody else can, or that we couldn't without him. In fact, I want to read you this quote by this very famous Christian, and he describes this Christian love for us. Now, he calls it spiritual love, but check out what he says. He says, "Spiritual love does not desire, but rather serves. It loves an enemy as a brother because it originates neither in the brother or the enemy, but in Christ and his word. Human love could never understand spiritual love, for spiritual love is from above. It is something completely strange, new, and not understandable to all earthly love." So Jesus calls us to live in a way that is radically different. In fact, when I think about this, I think about this video that went viral about a month and a half ago. And it was the story of this guy named Botham John, who was killed in his apartment. This woman came into his apartment, killed him in his own apartment. And regardless of what you think of the trial, you might know what I'm talking about or what happened. What went viral was there was this scene in the courtroom where, right, she was found guilty, and his brother, Botham's brother, spoke up and he said, "Listen, you killed my brother. In fact, my family wants you to rot in jail." He says, "I can't speak for my own family, but I love you as a person. And in fact, he pleaded with her to come to know Jesus. He says, if you come to God, he will forgive you as well. And he goes on to say, you might deserve it. I don't even want you to go to jail. I want what's best for you. And then what's crazy is he gets up and he goes over to her and he embraces her and he hugs her. And this video went viral because, again, this kind of love, this kind of forgiveness does not come natural to us, but it is possible because of Jesus. So now my question for you is this. Now that we see that we are Jonah, but we have a solution in the better Jonah, which is Jesus, my question is this. Who are those people in your life, right? Because I know some of you might be thinking, yeah, I know this. I've heard this, right? Love my enemies because Jesus loved me. But listen, the kind of love that the Bible calls us to is a kind of love that is hard. When it comes down to it, it's a love that is hard and that is a lot deeper than we know. Right? The longer I walk with Jesus, I'm able to see my sin in places that I didn't know before. And I'm able to better understand the love of Jesus for me. And that in turn helps me love other people. So who are those people in your life, right? I know that some of you might have deep, deep wounds from people that have hurt you. But the second question is, what does it mean to love, right? How do we do this in a way that is Christ-like? So now these are the questions that we are going to discuss in small groups as we break off now.